better? Thank you. Yeah, thanks. This is a painting by Pissarro, and it was a favorite painting of the Stodard family here in Worcester, and it was stolen and lost for a generation, shall we say. And we'll get into all those details. How many of you experienced that story in some way, were around when it happened? Okay, yeah, all right. Okay, well, some of these, my titles and things get clipped, but as you can maybe see, no you can't see, but this is a painting from 1902. All right, who were the Stodard family? Some of you knew them personally, Helen and Bob Stodard. They were very significant people here in Worcester, so generous to our community in so many ways. Let's just start with Bob. He was the head of, and this is an early photograph of them. He was the head of Wyman Gordon, which was the second largest company next to Norton here in Worcester, made Ford steel products. For example, in World War II, made parts for every plane that flew during the wars. In fact, that's their plant here in Worcester from the air. And then they have the plant in Grafton. This is where the new ballpark, roughly going to be in this area down McKelly Square. But anyway, Bob also was the head of the Worcester Telegram and Gazette. And these are two positions that he took over from his father. Harry G. Stodard was, in a way, Mr. Worcester. I like to think of the first half of the 20th century, and Bob was sort of one of those Mr. Worcesters of the second half of the 20th century. And his wife Helen, well, here you can see them. They lived in a life of style here in Worcester. They were very wealthy, but we like to say they also gave back, which is really to their credit to this community. But Bob was very fond of cars throughout his life. You can see here Helen stepping out of one of these fashionable cars as well. They lived a grand life, traveling helicopter. There was a helicopter pad at their home in Westwood Hills that he could fly to his offices down in Grafton. They traveled out west. They were big game hunters. We don't like to talk about that so much anymore. It's amazing. Yeah, but we will in a minute or two. But whether it was in Africa or up in Alaska. And they also, you can see, love to be with family. In fact, they're leaving their home on Monmouth Road there, going over to the street where I live on now, Masters Avenue, for the Stodard family, the father, Harry G. Stodard, for Christmas. You can see, I think it's a rather posed photograph. He's got all the presents in the back seat of this incredible car. Incredible car. Isn't it beautiful? Wow. And they had a fabulous garden, designed by Fletcher Steele. Some of you know Naum Keg, the same man who designed that. Beautiful garden that they opened to many people to come to see. And they were very involved in the Worcester Art Museum. Happy, luckily for all of us, but not just the Worcester Art Museum, many of the organizations. And let me tell you just a little bit. First of all, Bob was a trustee of the museum. They got very involved in the late 40s. Right, it was an exciting time for the museum too, because, well, first of all, it was after the war. The museum had just celebrated its 50th anniversary. And one of the organizations established at the Worcester Art Museum was the Members' Council, which was established by George Stout, the monuments man, director of the Worcester Art Museum, who decided that a museum should always be growing its generation of younger people. And so he started the Members' Council, and Helen was one of the first members of that. And it was a group of younger people who got people involved growing the membership of the Worcester Art Museum. Helen also was in the first class of docents in 1971. I know some of you have been part of that at the Worcester Art Museum. And they were collectors. The nice thing was they got to know many of the artists that they collected. For example, Andrew Wyeth. They got to know him. We have letters from Andrew Wyeth to Bob Stodard. And this wonderful woman here, George O'Keeffe, who had a major show at Worcester. In 1960, it was celebrating her 40th year as an artist, and it was Daniel Catton Rich, who was the director of the Worcester Art Museum throughout the 1960s, who had previously been chief curator and director of the Art Institute of Chicago, and had given Georgia O'Keeffe her first exhibition. He was actually a very close friend of hers. He was an executor to her will. Unfortunately, she outlived him, and she didn't give things away. Otherwise, I think we've gotten a major painting. Happily, the Stoddards invited her to their garden, and she went, visited, and then after that, they went down to New York and bought a painting that you see there on the right. And it was given to the Worcester Art Museum. It's our only painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, but a nice work to have, and it even has the original frame on it. Then I always think of Helen Stodard in connection with a show that the Worcester Art Museum did in the 1960s by Houdon. He's the great French sculptor. You may know, for example, the sculpture of Thomas Jefferson that he did, which is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. He sculpted many of the famous leaders of the 18th century. And Worcester did his first show, major show. And they borrowed from all over the world for that exhibition. This was under, again, Daniel Kettenridge, a major exhibition. And this is a photograph from the exhibition of the artist's three daughters, all done by the father. Three daughters, and they were lent to the Worcester Art Museum from three different collections. The one on the right, you may know, is Claudine, his 2-year-old daughter, done in marble. And when it was lent to the Worcester Art Museum, it was still available. It was in a private collection. And Helen Stoddard saw that, and she just fell in love with it. And of course she went to, she was not a shy lady. Some of you knew her. And she loved learning. She was an amazing person to be with because she just was interested in any subject. Anyway, she went up to Daniel Kettenridge and she said, I just can hear her stamping her foot on the floor, "That cannot leave the Worcester Art Museum." And you can imagine what Daniel Kettenridge said to her. Well, you could do something about that. And I checked it out. Within about a week or two, there was a check in the mail, it's now in our files, that they sent to buy it. And it has been there ever since. And of course, for Helen, who had 2 daughters, and you know one of them, I think, Val Loring, so responsible for this organization. The younger one there, I guess on the left, and Judy King on the right, 2 wonderful women who are such wonderful women who've done so much for our community here, including Briarwood. So there they are. And there's just a wonderful work of art that speaks of the generosity of that family. Also, but not just anything the museum wanted, they would help out on. And this is an interesting case in point. Oops. This show we did of 3 realists in 1974, including one of the greatest artists of the second half of the 20th century, Chuck Close, who's still with us, Richard Estes, another artist who made it big time, and Joseph Raphael, not as well known. And this was their first, certainly Chuck Close's first exhibition. So Helen said to Dick Tice, who's standing there at the right of the artist, that photograph on the left, said, well, we have to entertain those artists. And they did. And it was quite a story, I guess, because the cocktails were held in the game room where they had all their stuffed animals. And you can imagine, well, you might imagine, artists who were always ahead of the time were not happy with that environment. And Chuck Close said something that I can't repeat here, but basically, who in the blah, 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 blah shot all these? You can imagine it was like a New Yorker cartoon. I can imagine the martini glasses just falling on the floor. But anyway, this is a good example of the Stoddards just doing anything to help out the Worcester Art Museum. They gave generously through their foundations, and there you see Bob Stoddard at one of our bicentennial exhibitions. And then in 1979, Bob Stoddard gave us 10,000 shares in the Telegram and Gazette that I think at the time realized, I think it was about, say, $700,000-800,000, significant money in 1979. When the newspaper sold in the mid-'80s, and boy, the Stoddards were ahead of the game there in selling a newspaper, our shares realized $11.5 million. Yeah, and I had just become director. and I'd been curator before that. It was restricted for the purchase of art, Can you imagine a curator becoming director? Well, we were in financial challenging time at that point, and the foundation invited the trustees of the Worcester Art Museum to come back for a redesignation if they chose to do so, which we did, and we kept $5 million in the Art Acquisition Fund. It's our biggest fund and buys most of our major works of art. And then the other was toward endowment for operating, which the Stoddards continued to contribute to. They really were so important for helping the museum during a great period of transition, which was not only a period of transition for Worcester, but for museums across the country, because the cost of the industry standards were rising rapidly, from climate control, security, pension plans. We didn't have those things. And so the cost of running a museum really escalated in the 1980s, and we had to broaden our base of support. And it was really sort of the last time for a lot of the industrial captains and their families to be giving to the Worcester Art Museum. So the Stoddards really helped through that major transition for Worcester. Well, there they are in the 1950s, and this is when they began collecting. I should have mentioned that Helen, as a young woman, went to the Sorbonne in France, and she was a Francophile, and very interested in, of course, all art, but certainly the French artists. In 1951, they went to Knoedler, a great dealer in New York, who was a dealer who sold to most of the major collectors in America in the middle of the 20th century, who led to giving so many of their works to art museums across the country. They started buying American and French paintings, particularly Impressionists. And this is the work they bought. This is, again, 1902. It's a view at Dieppe on a gray day, and it's by Pissarro. Camille Pissarro is often called, quote, the dean of the Impressionist painters. He's the only Impressionist painter to exhibit in all 8 of the Impressionist shows, which were very daring at the time. These were people who were breaking away from the academy, and it was rather bold to exhibit your art, knowing that it probably was not going to be well received. He was also a father figure to the artists that went on to become what we call the post-Impressionist movement. You will know them well. Artists like Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Seurat. He was really the glue to that Impressionist movement. And we have many letters that he wrote to his son Lucien. For example, in July of 1902, he wrote, "My dear Lucien, well, here I am in Dieppe at the Hotel du Commerce." And he took a room upstairs so he could look out over the town. "I have rented a room on the second floor under the arcades of the fish market. This is my studio. I have a first-rate motif. Indeed, I have several. There aren't many people here, but the place will fill up later. The beautiful weather is attracting visitors. The English are the first to come as tourists and excursionists." And here are the views that he painted from that hotel room, including the one at the upper left there of the harbor area, the Bassin, different times of the day, and also throughout that season that he was there. And here you have a better view of the one at Worcester. In fact, about the time that he painted this picture, on August 11th, he wrote to his son, this is a month later, "My motifs are very beautiful. The fish market, the inner harbor, the Duquesne Bassin, or the harbor, in the rain, in the sun, in the smoke, etc." As you probably know, as with Monet, these artists painted the same scene at different times of the day and in different weather to show that they're really painting the light, and how the motif doesn't change, but the light changes everything. This was a strong point of the Impressionist artists. And so this is the view at Dieppe on a gray day, as its title is stated. Well, here you see it hanging in the Stoddard home, this black and white photograph, where it hung for many, many years. And it was a favorite of the Stoddards. They collected other works, but this was their all-time favorite. Here you see it. This is, I'm sorry to tell you, a photograph that our conservators just scream at. We advise you not to hang your painting over a fireplace or even on an outside wall, because the climate changes so rapidly, certainly in New England. As you know, we go from, maybe this would happen, from winter to spring within a day. Don't get your hopes up yet. But also, the climate is changing, humidity, all of that so rapidly. And so it's not a good idea. What we do, and this is just advice for all of you, if you do have a painting like that and you're hanging on an outside wall, have a backing that creates some kind of a barrier, sort of a little bit of a climate control area there in the back. In any case, I am happy to tell you at this point, this is one of the best preserved paintings that has survived with Pissarro. We learned later on. It is amazing considering its story. In any case, in 1978, it was stolen from the home. We'll go into more details on this, but basically, it was gone. What happened was Helen Stodard was having surgery at the hospital here in Worcester. So her husband, who worked long hours, came home that night. As Helen said, Bob, I slept very well. He went to bed, and he must have slept very well because the thieves ransacked the home, stole many paintings, 10 of them, and then they found the poker to the fireplace, that fireplace there, outside his bedroom. So he survived. We were notified immediately at the Worcester Art Museum about the theft, of course. I had come to the museum in 1974, so this is 4 years later. I got to know the Stoddards. One of the things I did right away was get in touch with what was called IFAR in New York, which was established in 1969 for a number of reasons, but tracking art, particularly stolen art. And they began publishing in 1976, 2 years before this theft, stolen art alerts. But of course this is before all the computers and laptops that we have and smartphones. So all of this material just went into a drawer at the headquarters. Unlike today, I should just tell you that these art loss registries, they're available now to all of the art dealers, to the auction houses, Sotheby's, Christie's, and as soon as someone brings in a work of art, they will check it if it's stolen or not. So it's not likely to happen today as much. Well, I did get to know the Stoddards quite well. In fact, before I get into that, just to show you, here are black and whites of some of the other paintings that were stolen. You can see a little painting by Renoir, which was their first work, only about this big. I remember Helen telling me the story about that. They went to New York and they had it on loan to see whether they'd like it. And how smart of the dealer. He said, just take it home and live with it for a while. Helen told me the story. She and Bob went, I guess, up north for the weekend in one of their great cars on the ride. And I guess the whole trip up and back was, I can't live without that painting. I can't live without that painting. Well, the dealer was right. And they bought it. This was not a very expensive picture, but that was as we say, collecting it's a hobby, but it's also a disease, and it's a great disease. And they kept buying works of art. The one on the lower left is a wonderful work by a Dutch artist, impressionist, Jonkin, also stolen. They're still out there, these works, so they may come back, we don't know. Another work I don't have a photograph of for you, but a great winter scene by a Dutch artist named Aberkamp, one of the great masters of the 17th century. And I was preparing for a major show at the Worcester Art Museum. I have that extra now, let's see. No. At the Worcester Art Museum, and I was going to borrow it for a show called Raising the Curtain, 17th century paintings from private collections in New England. And we were brought in to examine it more closely, to x-ray all of that. But unfortunately, Mrs. Stodard needed it back for one more dinner party. Unfortunately, it was stolen. It's still out there. Maybe it will surface. Well, Bob and I got to know quite well, actually. We didn't always agree politically, like most people wouldn't with Bob. He was very conservative, very far right. He was actually a founder of the John Birch Society. He did have a sense of humor, happily. In fact, it's always been told to me that, this was before I came to the museum, that one day at one of the board meetings, a gentleman, a new trustee, came in late, very embarrassed, and because he was late, and there was one chair sitting right empty next to Bob Stodard. He just leaned over and said, "Psst, psst, psst." do you mind if I sit next to it? He said, well, you can, but it's to my right, so you might fall off the face of the earth. He had a sense of humor. And most important for me is he really gave back to society, and he did such wonderful things for other people. In any case, when the painting was stolen, they had an insurance program, so they bought some other paintings. They bought another Pissarro. And here's the painting, an earlier work from 1883. I always remember this work here. You see the two together. I'm happy to tell you that happy ending. They're both at the Worcester Art Museum now. They also bought this wonderful Corot. We have several, but this is certainly one of our finest. And then this beautiful Alfred Sisley called Le Lavoir, which means the laundry, which is the laundry place there in the foreground where people come outside the village to do their laundry. Beautiful impressionist picture. One of our most impressionistic paintings, actually. And then I already mentioned the Stodard Acquisition Fund that they gave to the museum. Well, I had the pleasure of going to the Stodard home quite often for many of the different parties, etc. I might have seen this painting, but probably unlikely because I really got to know them better when I became director, but as chief curator, which was 1980. In any case, as I mentioned, when I did the show in 1979, I was going to borrow the Abercrombie painting. And that's when I really got to know the Stoddards. Here you see Bob. And it's good to show him with a laugh because he did have a great sense of humor. But I remember going to the house to see the painting that they bought as a replacement. And Bob pointed to that smokestack and he said, Jim, this was a symbol of progress in the 19th century. And knowing, of course, all the black smoke from Wyman Gordon, which obviously we've done a lot to clean up. I also remember Bob very early on when I came to the Worcester Art Museum. He was on the board. And this little painting here you see on the left, and I should say little, it's only about that big. And I remember when I saw it for the first time when I came for my interview at the Worcester Art Museum, went into the Dutch collection, and many of you know that's my special field, and saw this painting. I thought, this is a great museum. This is a painting that we bought, George Stout bought in 1951, the great conservator, so he was concerned about condition and all those things. Also, right after the war to make sure that it was not Nazi confiscated. But I remember, I guess probably the first time I met Bob Stodard, and he said, I heard your field is Dutch art. I said, yes, sir, that's right. He said, you know that little Dutch painting up in the gallery, that winter scene? That's probably the most expensive picture per square inch that we own. And I said, what do you mean by that? Well, I knew what he meant. He said, we paid $9,000 for that painting. Well, we're so lucky we paid $9,000 for that painting. Since then, we have found, I think I slide that. That it's one of 4 paintings of the 4 seasons. 2 are at the Getty now, bought after ours, and then one's, I think, still in a private collection. And we now think that they were descended in the family of the Secretary of State of Holland, someone who commissioned Rembrandt as well. So it's a great little painting, and it's worth every bit of its $9,000. And happily we bought it when we did. As I got to know Bob and knew that he liked art, I thought, well, he could afford more, right? Especially after the theft. And so it was Helen's 80th birthday coming up, and I said, wouldn't it be nice for you to buy a present for Helen on her 80th birthday? I'm sure he wasn't going to forget it. But he said, well, yeah. I said, well, I'll look for a picture if you want one, maybe even a small one. And it won't be nearly as much as you paid back as we paid in '51. So I was in Europe and I saw this painting. Actually, it looks very much like a Dutch painting, but it is a French master. And it's only about this big. So I showed him a transparency of it. And he said, why not? So he bought it and they acquired that. Well then, when their 50th wedding anniversary was coming up in 1983, I said to Bob, don't you need to document that occasion as well? And knowing that they had lost a great Dutch, or let's say Netherlandish painting. I thought, wouldn't this be wonderful? I knew how much Helen loved the Dutch and Flemish collection. And so I found this painting in New York with a dealer, and bigger, about this big. You can see it at the Worcester Art Museum. It's painted on metal and copper, and it's one you have to look at in great detail. It's just filled with all kinds of wildlife, and knowing of their interests in nature. It's got a blue heron coming up over here on the left, if you can see it. I always think of Mark Lynch, one of our great birders here in New England. There's an owl up there and a woodpecker. He said, if you see those in the same tree, it means you're in a deep forest. He used to give a regular bird tour at the Worcester Art Museum, examining all the creatures in these paintings. So I'll never forget that, because I said, Bob, I have a wonderful painting. Can I show you the transparency? He said, sure. Well, it turned out I was going to a dinner party that night at their home, and he said, let's just meet in the game room. I thought, well, this is probably appropriate for the game room. So we met, first of all, in the game room. There were no cocktails in the game room that night. And I showed him the transparency, and he said, well, it looks pretty good to me. Why don't you bring it up? So I had it arranged for it to come up to the museum, and I'll never forget that evening when he pulled up in his Bentley after 5 o'clock, and we went, in those days the conservation lab was down in the basement, and I showed him the painting, telling him all the details, but he was quick to notice the detail at the lower left, and you can see it as I blow it up here. There's some hunters there, and they've just shot some wild game. And he quickly pointed to the red dot on the one deer. He said, perfect shot, we'll take this one. Oh my God. Anyway, that's how it got into the museum. That's how it finally came to Worcester. But, you know, it's sort of there's an amusing story about that, because when we usually sell a painting in a gallery, they put a red dot on it. Well, here the red dot was already on it. In any case, when I did further examination, I found that when this was in a French collection, the frame had overlapped that part of the painting because someone didn't want that, probably in their dining room. But the Stoddards, that was no problem. So it went into their collection. It may amaze you to know that Bob Stoddard put up the money for this wonderful sculpture that we have in this now called Stoddard Garden Court, the Pomodoro. I would say you'd be amazed, because Bob was not that fond of contemporary art. Like many of our trustees in those days, they had a hard time accepting abstract art, modern art, certainly abstract expressionism back in the 1960s, and he was among them. So it's always surprising, in a way, to think that he bought this work of art, but if you think of his industry, Wyman Gordon, Forged Steel, you can see why he bought this. I'll tell you a cute little story about this one. We bought it, and maybe you've seen another example of this work in the Vatican. Italian artist is all around the world, but this is one of his key works, another version of it in the Vatican. In any case, our conservators were getting a little worried about this particular piece, because it's on a pin. The heavy metal ball is on a pin, and the pin was starting to corrode being outside, okay? And I guess, well, no, I know that, I don't know whether Daniel Catton-Rich, who would have been director at the time it was hired, whether he said anything, but I know that Dick Tice, director, told me that he said, you know, we've got to do something about the Pomodoro with the pin. And Bob was a can-do-it guy. One day he shows up a couple of weeks later in the director's office. He said, I took care of the problem for you. And Dick Tice said, what do you mean? He said, I put a collar around that pin. This would never happen today, but we left that collar on the pin. It's such a part of the story here. The piece underneath the ball was added by Bob Stoddard. He literally went out and measured the pin, and he had a piece of stone cut, 2 pieces. They could just put it in and protect the piece. Since then, our conservators have done conservation work on the piece, but they were very concerned about the ball just rolling across the court. But this does help protect it from the weather. As I say, I don't think those things would happen again today, but these are all the stories of how our museums were built. Bob Stodard, like so many people, as I said, were not keen on contemporary art, but he went the extra mile. He collected these cartoons about modern art. I remember them so well. I particularly remember working in my father's ice cream store every night, reading the newspaper there, and I think every night there was a cartoon about contemporary art. And being an artist as a young man, I thought, gee, why can't they understand this thing? Give the people a break. But Bob was one of those people who collected these. And I had a whole wall full of them. And I'll just show you a couple of them. This one, as you can see, they're looking at Van Gogh's painting, The Starry Night at the Moment, and it says, "Who funded him?" And then this one, probably hard for you to read back there, "Deceiving the Public." Now that's a fine art. And then this one, I don't know if it was sending any of us a message, but purchased in 1986. This painting cost the museum $6 million and the director his job. He did have a good sense of humor. Yeah. Okay. And there is Bob Stodard. Interesting to note the wonderful photograph here. Just forgetting the artist's name, but the same artist who photographed Winston Churchill and all the other great people of the 20th century. In any case, Helen Stodard lived a long life, and here she is coming to the Art Museum, but Bob died in 1984. The photograph that I just showed you is by Karsh, the great Canadian photographer, who visited the Worcester Art Museum as well. In any case, here's Helen. One story that I learned about more recently was this, and I'll put Bob back on the screen. After the painting was stolen, all those paintings were stolen, of course, got reported to the local police. And within a couple of days, I guess, Bob got a call from obviously a young man, judging from his voice, and said, "I know where the paintings are. If you will put some money in a satchel, meet me at a dumpster, or put it in this dumpster, I'll make sure they get back." And so he called the police, smart of him, of course. He took a satchel, I don't think there was any money in it, threw it in the dumpster, came back home. They arrested the person who went into the dumpster. It was a young man, and turned out that he was working in Stodard Garden that summer. I think I have to give a lot of credit to Bob. He did not file charges. You know, he probably did some stupid things in his youth, like we all do in our youth. He felt he would learn his lesson. I guess they knew the family well. But he did not file charges. I just imagine what would have happened to that kid otherwise in jail. Anyway, that's the story. Helen lived on. You can see her late in life here, into her 90s, always coming to the Worcester Art Museum, serving as a docent as long as she could. One day, in 1991, she got a call from Joachim Pissarro. This is a relative of the artist. This is his grandson, Joachim. Just to tell you, he was curator at the, he had many interesting jobs in his life, but at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, also at Yale University and elsewhere, and did a lot of publishing. Well, he was working on a catalogue raisonné, 3 volumes, to document all of his grandfather's works. And he wanted to know what happened to this painting that was sold by the Noodlers back in the 1950s. So he called Mrs. Stodard, and he referred to this catalog back in, let's see, the date here is 39. Yeah, 39, right, just before the war. He referred to it because he was updating this catalog. And this catalog was done by one of Joachim Pissarro's sons. So now we're on the 3rd generation. And of course, Mrs. Stodard had to tell him it was stolen back in 1978. He said, "Well, I'm really very sorry about that." He said, "I have made a note of," and this is quote, "I have made a note in my archives of this theft, and of course, if I do hear anything at all which may help in locating these works, I will let you know." Okay. Eventually, in 2005, it took a long time, it does, to do 3 volumes. You can imagine, documenting all of his grandfather's work. It came out, this is just one of the volumes, which we have all 3 at the Worcester Art Museum. Well then, years later, October 17th, 1998, it's a day I will never forget. I began my week that year, in 1978, in October, in Cleveland. I was out there for an AMD meeting, Association of Art Museum Directors, and I came back on a Friday night, late, got home, and the light was beeping on my phone, and there were a couple messages, not from Mrs. Stodard, but from her nurse. And she said to me, "Mr. Welu, please call us whenever you get in, even if it's midnight. Mrs. Stodard has something to tell you." And she continued, "Exciting." You know, when you're that age. Anyway, she was 94 years old then. I called right away, and Mrs. Stodard got on the phone and she said, Jim, the Pissarro has been found." I said, "Oh my God, where?" She said, "Cleveland." I said, "Melanie, where do you think I just went?" Oh my God. And she told me the story. Now, I will tell you more because I've learned more since. That was an interesting day. She got a call from a dealer in New York named Mr. Beatleston. What happened was he was, I think, having lunch that day with a collector who was looking to bid at auction for Pissarro in an auction out in Cleveland. Big sale. See, there you see Mrs. Stodard at that age. Okay, and this is the sale, the Wolf Gallery out in a very big auction house at that time. This collector was going to bid on this painting, which is on the cover of the catalog. A huge catalog, huge number of works. And the dealer said, "Well, we should check it out before you bid." He said, "Look, why don't we call Joachim Pissarro? He's up at Yale University right now." He had been at the Met. And so they did. And he called him, and of course, what did he say? He said, "Oh, that was stolen from the Stodard family. I talked to Mrs. Stodard a number of years ago." Just like that, the light bulb went off in the head of the dealer. He's the one who sold the Stoddards the replacement paintings, including the other Pissarro. So what did he do? He went back to his office, got on his Rolodex, looked up the Stoddard, phone number the same, things you can't do so well today, actually. He called the house, and I guess the nurse answered the phone, and he said, "Is Mr. Stodard there?" And she said, "Oh, he died many years ago. Would you like to speak to his widow? Is she still living? May I tell her who called?" He said, "Oh, she won't remember me," but she did. She got on the phone, and the rest is sort of history. And that's when she left the message at my phone. And so what I did the very next day, it was pretty late that night, I called Warner Fletcher, who is her nephew, who was away for the weekend up in Maine. Reached him up there, and we talked, and I was going to New York the following week on Monday for another meeting, AMD again, and I said, "Well, look, we can report to the FBI, and I'll talk to IFAR down there and see what we could do." So we did, and then Warner went to work on this. He contacted the FBI to ask them to hold up the sale, which he knew was asking a lot, because the sale was going to be within a week. He knew that was a great imposition, but he did want the FBI to seize the painting. Mr. Wolf got back to Warner. He said, "What if we sold the painting and held the proceeds for the FBI to deal with it?" And Warner, who has a great sense of humor, said, "Well, he said, I didn't think that Helen would like his proposal regarding a 20-year, quote, unauthorized loan." And then the legal battle ensued. Well, happily, the FBI did seize the painting right before the sale. But here you can see the detail of the sale. This is the painting we're talking about. So what happened was, it gets fairly complicated. I'll try to spare you the details. But really a sort of legal battle ensues, and there was a young Cleveland lawyer that represented the man who consigned the work of art to the sale. Okay? Now we learned later on that he bought the painting with a couple other paintings for $10,000. He bought it from a woman in Cleveland who needed a loan. And basically, that lawyer was arguing for his client that there were two paintings, and the one coming up for sale was the original, and Mrs. Stodard had a copy or another version. Of course, Helen wouldn't like to hear that, and it wasn't true. At the same time, they're using the provenance of the Stodard painting to show that it's an original work of art. So it was very interesting because, in a way, the Stoddards didn't have a claim to the painting in a way because Liberty Mutual had paid them money giving up their rights to the painting, and then they bought other paintings. It's rather complicated. Thank God we had Warner and another one of his lawyer colleagues working on this. The lawyer out in Cleveland even proposed that maybe Mr. Stodard was staging a theft, or at least the client he was representing, that he had a fate and to collect the insurance proceeds. All kinds of things were coming out of Cleveland at that point. Well, probably the happy news is that Mrs. Stodard wrote a codicil to her will right away, that if the painting would ever come back to Worcester, it would go to the Worcester Art Museum. Okay? So within weeks they began to prepare for a trial. And Warner and I met with him recently to go over some of these details. They thought it was unlikely that Helen would go out to Cleveland at that age to testify, but they thought that they should have her do a deposition. How many of you have done a deposition? A few of you have, yeah. Not so much fun, is it? No. Anyway, Warner and Doug Maestri, the other lawyer, arranged for a deposition with Helen at her home, make it very comfortable for her. And this was going to be on a Tuesday, but they thought, let's prepare her for this. So the week before, on a Friday, they show up to the house, but they told her they were coming. And she came down the stairs, dressed to the nines, and Warner said, "Now, I hope you won't be nervous." And she said, "Me nervous? It's my painting." Well, unfortunately for Helen, she got all dressed up thinking that was going to be the deposition, and they were going to do a trial for her. I guess it was sort of hilarious being there because Warner told me it was really, I should have mentioned that during all this time they also arranged for Dick Tice, who was director in the 1970s during the theft, who had seen the painting, knew it certainly better than me, flew up from Texas where he was at the time to authenticate and say that as best he could say it was the original work of art. But here they're doing the deposition in Mrs. Stoddard's home, in front of the fireplace. Nothing had really changed except for the other painting was up there now, taking the place of the later Pissarro. And Warner told me a true story that he had already forgotten, but I remember him telling me that he said, "Now, tell this lawyer here from Cleveland about the great French Impressionist Pissarro." And of course, Helen thinking about him in his later years when this painting was done, and she said, "Warner, he's a post-impressionist, he's not an impressionist. If you would have studied art history at Williams, you would have done much better." Poor Warner. I feel sorry for him. But anyway, he did a great job for us. So basically, she did put the codicil to her will. So now you have three contenders for the painting. If the painting would come to Worcester, you have the Worcester Art Museum, but you also have Liberty Mutual, and then you have the man out in Cleveland. Now, Liberty Mutual had paid, let me see here. Okay, let's see. Oh, wait, maybe I'll take a little quick detour here. In the meantime, Joachim Pissarro was Warner got in touch with him right away, and he sat with the lawyer from Cleveland, and they had these three photographs to work with. The catalog, a colored photograph, the original painting, the photograph in front of the fire, on top of the fire, and then the catalog from 1939, and then another photograph. And apparently, Joachim Pissarro, the lawyer, was giving him a pretty tough time and asking him for his deposition. And so he's presented these 5 photographs, and he said, "Are these the same painting?" And this is a quote. He said, "As to whether these 5 pictures are the same painting, an 8-year-old could tell you they are the same painting. As to authentication, that would take a little bit more time. But if you were to spend a half a day with me, you could authenticate this painting as being a real Pissarro." Okay? Well, I should tell you, Mrs. Stodard died within 6 weeks after learning about the theft. And this was a painting that they'd enjoyed for 27 years. But thank goodness that she did put a codicil to her will. But what happened was, there she is, see her long life. Liberty Mutual, I have such respect for this insurance company. They felt that they should be paid the money that they gave out to the Stodard family, which was $90,000. But they said, we don't expect the interest, which was $120,000. Now, we're talking about a painting that was valued at the time, about $1.5 to $2 million back in the 90s when it was recovered. Okay, they gave up, the Stoddards arranged to give the money that they were, the insurance money back to them, and then you have 2 contenders. Well, then the gentleman, I don't know if I should call him a gentleman, but anyway, from Cleveland, decided, wow, that painting's worth so much money, I could get a great tax deduction if I gave it to the Worcester Art Museum. And he wanted to give it in memory of Mrs. Stodard now, who had passed away. And he decided that would be great. So then he was going to be eliminated from the equation. We were presenting it to the Committee on the Collection to be going forward on it, I remember. It was not too uneasy because I knew about the work of art, but I hadn't seen the original yet when I returned, but we were presenting to the Committee on the Collection. And then after that meeting, where it was approved, I got a call from Warner. He said, "The deal's off." I said, "What do you mean?" "The deal's off." I said, "Why?" He said, "We're not going to deal with this gentleman from in the way he proposes from Cleveland, because he wants to bring the tax break is so great. One, that first of all, he didn't realize he has to wait a year to own it to get the tax break. It was only 6 months roughly. He decided that he couldn't do that. Also, he wanted to bring in some other friends on the deal, and they just were not going to go there. So Warner said, we're going to settle out of court. So they settled out of court. I don't know what the settlement amounted to, but they just wanted to make sure that this painting that Helen had put in her codicil and her will would come to the Worcester Art Museum, would come to the Worcester Art Museum. And so it did. And that's where you can see it. And it did arrive at the Worcester Art Museum, and here you see it was a pretty exciting day when it came into our conservation lab. You can see our preparators, the photographer even there on the stool, or on a little ladder there, photographing it. I think the most exciting thing for our staff was to see the tape of the FBI as evidence. In fact, we saved that tape. You can see a piece of it in the file on this painting. Here you see that was my first glimpse of it returning to the Art Museum. And then we did an exhibition around it. Some of you may have been to that show. The local paper, well, there's the label for the painting, and you can see the evidence tape there. And this was a major promotion we had from the Telegram and Gazette, of course, for the show called Heist. And maybe that's you there, I don't know. In any case, what's the good news? Well, the good news is both of those paintings are at the Worcester Art Museum. I have to say, if there were no theft, we wouldn't have the earlier painting, because that was a replacement painting. We represent Pissarro very well at the Worcester Art Museum. Happily, so many of the other works came in from the Stodard collection, including this Corot replacement picture and the Sisley picture. And then another happy outcome was that we invited Joachim Pissarro to the Worcester Art Museum to give a talk about his grandfather's work at the Stodard, at our Salisbury event, and there he is with Warner Fletcher and myself. And he's the one who said, it's one of the best preserved paintings I have seen of my grandfather. So that was nice to hear. And so the Stodard legacy lives on in so many ways at the Worcester Art Museum. Not only the works of art, the acquisition fund, and in general our community has benefited so much from this family that has given back, and we're so happy that their favorite painting is at the Worcester Art Museum. Thank you.